Somewhere on this planet right now, two dark-haired parents are holding a baby with red hair, staring at it with that specific expression that is approximately 70% wonder and 30% unspoken questions about the mailman. Meanwhile, across town, a child who had perfectly blonde hair at age 5 has somehow woken up at age 15 with hair so brown it's barely recognizable. And somewhere else, a perfectly healthy person in their mid-30s is finding their first gray hair and immediately Googling whether stress can cause it, while simultaneously refusing to accept the answer. Hair color is one of the most visible, most personal, and most genetically complicated things about you. People dye it. People obsess over it. People make sweeping personality assumptions about strangers based on it. An entire mythology of blondes, brunettes, redheads, and silver foxes has been constructed and maintained by society with remarkable dedication and very little justification. And yet, despite being something you look at in the mirror every day, most people have essentially no idea how it actually works. Not, what's the name of the pigment? That's the boring version, the real version. Why your specific shade exists. Why red hair is so rare it shows up in only 1 to 2% of all humans on Earth. Why children with blonde hair often end up with brown hair by their 20s. Why your hair is gradually turning gray, and what is actually happening inside the follicle when it does. Why two people with technically the same hair color can look completely different in the right lighting. And why, hidden inside all of this biology, is a story about UV radiation, vitamin D, ancient human migration, and a single gene that has been quietly shaping the populations of entire continents for tens of thousands of years. The answer to all of it starts with two molecules, a switch, and a cell that most people have never heard of. Inside every hair follicle in your scalp, nestled at the base where new hair is being actively constructed, there are cells called melanocytes. These are specialized pigment-producing cells, and their entire purpose in life is to manufacture color and inject it into the hair shaft as it grows. They are, in a sense, tiny living spray guns, coating each new strand of keratin with pigment before it pushes up through the skin and becomes the hair you can actually see and touch. They do this continuously with every hair, for every growth cycle, for your entire life, or at least for as long as the system keeps functioning, which we'll get to. The pigment they produce is called melanin, and melanin comes in two chemically distinct types. The first is eumelanin, dark, stable, brown to black in color. The second is pheomelanin, lighter, less stable, red to yellow in color. These two pigments are not just shades of the same thing. They are genuinely different compounds produced through different biochemical pathways with different structural properties, different levels of UV protection, and different stability when exposed to light and oxidative stress. Every natural human hair color that exists, every shade of black, brown, auburn, blonde, strawberry, copper, red, and every nuanced variation in between, is produced by some combination of these two pigments in different ratios and different concentrations injected into the hair shaft by melanocytes doing their job. Black hair, high concentration of eumelanin, very little pheomelanin. The eumelanin is dense, the melanosomes carrying it are large and numerous, and the result is a deep, light-absorbing dark color. Brown hair, eumelanin again, but in lower quantities and sometimes in a slightly different chemical form, with the specific shade depending on how much is present and how it's distributed through the cortex of the hair shaft. Blonde hair, very low levels of both pigments, but especially low eumelanin, so little that what remains barely registers visually, allowing the natural translucency of the keratin shaft to come through. Red hair, this is where things get genuinely interesting. Because red hair isn't simply less dark, it's the result of a fundamentally different pigment balance, with pheomelanin dominating over eumelanin in a way that produces those distinctive, warm, coppery, amber, and ginger tones that exist nowhere else in the human color palette. White hair produces no melanin at all, but we'll get to that. The ratio of these two pigments and the total quantity of each is what determines your specific shade. It's not a single dial. It's more like a mixing board with multiple inputs, each controlled by different genetic variables, all running simultaneously. And the person running that mixing board, setting the levels, is your genome. Here's where genetics enters the picture and where things get significantly more complicated than most people expect. If you were taught in school that hair color follows simple dominant and recessive inheritance, dark hair dominant over light, that sort of thing, you were taught a useful simplification that is, in reality, not quite how it works. Hair color in humans is a polygenic trait, meaning it's controlled not by one or two genes, but by a large number of genes working together, each contributing a small piece of the final result. For blonde hair alone, researchers have now identified over 200 genetic variants that each contribute a small effect to the final color. 200. Not one gene, not a handful. Over 200 different locations spread across your genome, each nudging your melanocyte output slightly one way or another, and their combined effect produces the shade you were born with. This is why predicting hair color from ancestry tests is genuinely difficult. The system is complex enough that small errors compound quickly. But within this complexity, there is one gene that plays an outsized starring role, especially for certain hair colors. That gene is called MC1R, the melanocortin 1 receptor, and it functions as something close to the master switch of the melanin production system. Here's what MC1R does. It encodes a receptor protein that sits on the surface of melanocytes. When this receptor is activated, when it receives its signal and switches on, the melanocyte defaults to producing eumelanin, dark pigment, brown, and black tones. This is the baseline setting, the evolutionary default, the hair color that appears to have been most common in ancestral human populations going back millions of years. When the MC1R receptor is working correctly and fully functional, you are very likely to end up with dark hair, regardless of what else your genome is doing. The system is running as designed. But when MC1R is malfunctioning, when you inherit a variant of the gene that produces a non-functional or reduced function receptor, the melanocyte can no longer switch reliably into eumelanin production mode. Instead, it falls back to making pheomelanin, the red-yellow pigment. And if you inherit two copies of a non-functional MC1R variant, one from each parent, your melanocytes are essentially running on the fallback setting permanently. The result is red hair, the full spectrum of it, from auburn to copper to bright flame red ginger, along with the pale skin, light eyes, and increased sun sensitivity that frequently accompany it, because the same MC1R pathway influences pigmentation across all of these systems simultaneously. This is why red hair behaves the way it does genetically. You need two non-functional copies of MC1R to reliably produce the full red hair phenotype. One functional copy is usually enough to keep eumelanin production going at a sufficient level. Two non-functional copies tips the balance firmly and permanently toward pheomelanin. Parents can each carry one non-functional copy, enough to give them slightly warmer toned hair or perhaps nothing visibly unusual at all, and still produce a fully red-haired child if that child inherits the non-functional variant from both of them. This is why red hair appears to skip generations, why it shows up unexpectedly in families where no one seems to obviously carry it. The gene is there, hiding in people who don't look like redheads, waiting for the probabilistic lottery of inheritance to bring two copies together in the same child. Every time two MC1R carriers have a child, there's roughly a 25% chance that child will inherit both non-functional copies and express red hair. A 50% chance the child inherits one copy and becomes a carrier themselves. A 25% chance the child inherits no non-functional copies at all. These are Mendelian odds playing out across generations, producing redheads scattered apparently randomly through family trees in a pattern that made perfect sense to no one until the genetics were understood. That 25% chance, combined with the relative rarity of the non-functional MC1R variant in global human populations, is why only about 1 to 2% of people worldwide have naturally red hair. In Ireland and Scotland, where these variants became far more common through a combination of founding population genetics and geographic isolation, the rates climbed to around 10 to 13%, which is why those regions have become culturally synonymous with red hair in a way that genuinely reflects underlying population genetics rather than stereotype. Red hair is not a fluke. It is a specific, predictable genetic outcome that becomes common only where the right variants have accumulated in a population over many generations of people who happen to carry them. This raises the obvious question. Why did those variants accumulate where they did? Why is red hair concentrated in Northern and Western Europe? Why did evolution allow MC1R to stop functioning reliably in these populations when functioning MC1R produces the UV protective melanin that essentially all mammals ancestrally carry? The answer is sunlight, or more specifically, the chronic lack of it. Human beings evolved in Africa, in high UV equatorial environments where dark, eumelanin-heavy pigmentation was genuinely protective and critically necessary. Eumelanin absorbs UV radiation and dissipates it as heat before it can penetrate to deeper skin layers, damage DNA in skin cells, and increase cancer risk. Dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair are the ancestral human condition, a baseline optimized for life on the African savanna where UV exposure is intense year-round for hundreds of thousands of years. But when modern humans began migrating out of Africa into Europe, roughly 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, they moved into environments with dramatically reduced sunlight. Higher latitudes, longer winters, lower sun angles, frequent cloud cover. And this created a new biological problem that hadn't existed before. Eumelanin, which was protecting them from UV damage in Africa, was now blocking the UV radiation they needed to synthesize vitamin D. Vitamin D synthesis in human skin is driven by UVB radiation penetrating the skin and converting a cholesterol compound into the precursor of active vitamin D. This process requires UV light reaching the skin cells. Eumelanin is so effective at absorbing UV radiation that in low sunlight environments, particularly during winter months at high latitudes, very dark skin can block enough UV to significantly impair vitamin D production. Vitamin D deficiency in ancestral environments meant weaker bones, compromised immune function, higher infant mortality, and reduced reproductive success. It was a genuine evolutionary pressure, not a minor inconvenience. Natural selection responded over thousands of years by favoring genetic variants that reduced eumelanin production in these northern populations, producing lighter skin, lighter eyes, and lighter or more varied hair. Because these lighter pigmentation variants allowed more UV light to penetrate the skin when UV was scarce, supporting the vitamin D synthesis that dark skin was blocking. The loss of MC1R function in Northern European populations wasn't random genetic drift. It was, at least in part, an adaptive trade-off. Surrender some UV protection in an environment where UV damage is less of a daily threat, in exchange for better vitamin D synthesis when sunlight is weak and winter is long. Red hair was the visible side effect of this adaptation. A 2026 study analyzing ancient human DNA from nearly 16,000 individuals spanning the last 10,000 years found direct genetic evidence that MC1R variants associated with red hair and pale skin were actively selected for in European populations, with the strongest selection signal appearing around the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural lifestyles. The shift to farming reduced dietary access to the fatty fish, organ meats, and other animal-sourced foods that provided dietary vitamin D to hunter-gatherers, making the body's ability to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight even more critical, and therefore making lighter pigmentation even more biologically valuable. The redhead gene, tracked through ancient genomes across millennia, shows the unmistakable signature of natural selection steadily increasing its frequency in populations that needed it. Now let's talk about why your hair color may not be static throughout your life, because this surprises more people than it probably should and is considerably more interesting than most people realize. Many children are born with blonde or very light hair that gradually darkens through childhood and adolescence into distinctly brown or even dark brown hair. This is not an anomaly or a mystery. It is a normal developmental process rooted in melanocyte biology. Melanocytes take time to reach full adult production capacity. At birth, the melanocyte system is not yet running at the rate it will eventually sustain. The cells are present and functional, but they're not yet manufacturing and injecting pigment at adult levels. As the child grows and the hormonal environment shifts, particularly around puberty, when sex hormones including estrogen and testosterone rise significantly, melanocyte activity ramps up, and your melanin output increases. The result is that hair which read as clearly blonde at age 5 can look distinctly medium brown by age 20, without anything unusual having happened. The genetics were always pointing toward darker hair at full expression. The system just needed time and the right hormonal conditions to fully get there. This developmental darkening explains something that parents frequently find confusing: why their blonde child's hair seems to deepen every year without any obvious cause. It's not a mystery. It's melanocytes doing what melanocytes eventually do when the body provides the right hormonal signals. Conversely, hormonal disruptions throughout adult life, pregnancy, thyroid conditions, certain medications, significant nutritional deficiencies, can shift hair pigmentation temporarily or even permanently, because melanocyte function is responsive to the hormonal environment it operates in. Your hair color is not a fixed setting permanently decided at birth. It is a continuous output of a living biological process running in real time that can be modulated by what's happening in your body. And then there's the gray, the thing everyone notices, the thing that arrives uninvited and stays permanently. Gray hair is not a different pigment. Gray hair is not actually gray at the molecular level. What looks gray, fawn, or silver, or white is hair that contains no pigment whatsoever. A single white hair is essentially transparent. The color you perceive is an optical effect, colorless, transparent hair shafts catching and scattering light in a way that the human visual system interprets as gray or silver when it's interspersed with remaining pigmented hairs. Individually, white hairs are clear. In quantity and combination, they produce the gray gradient that progresses with age. The pigment disappears because of a failure in the melanocyte stem cell supply chain. Here's how it works. The melanocytes that inject pigment into each hair shaft are not immortal. They have finite lifespans, and they need to be continuously replenished to keep coloring new hairs across decades of hair growth cycles. This replenishment happens via a reservoir of melanocyte stem cells, specialized cells that sit in a protected compartment within the hair follicle called the bulge, waiting to be called into service each time a new hair cycle begins. When the follicle sends the signal that a new growth cycle is starting, stem cells from this reservoir travel to the base of the follicle, mature into active melanocytes, and begin producing pigment for the new hair. This system works beautifully in youth because the stem cell reservoir is healthy, abundant, and fully responsive to the signals it receives. But with age, two things happen to progressively undermine it. First, the stem cell pool depletes. With each hair cycle, some stem cells differentiate into mature cells and don't renew themselves back into the stem cell pool. Over decades of hair cycles, and humans go through many hundreds over a lifetime, this reservoir shrinks. A landmark 2023 study published in Nature discovered a specific mechanism contributing to this. As follicles age, melanocyte stem cells increasingly get physically stuck in the wrong region of the follicle. They end up stranded between the bulge and the hair germ compartment, unable to receive the maturation signals they need to become functional melanocytes, and unable to return to the stem cell reservoir either. They're not dead. They're stuck, and stuck melanocyte stem cells produce no pigment, as more and more stem cells end up stranded. In this way, with each passing hair cycle, fewer melanocytes are available to color new hairs, and the gray fraction progressively increases. Second, the follicle's own chemistry turns against its melanocytes through oxidative stress. Producing melanin is biochemically expensive, and it generates reactive oxygen species, chemically damaging molecules, as a byproduct of the production process itself. In youth, the follicle maintains robust antioxidant defenses, including an enzyme called catalase that neutralizes hydrogen peroxide before it accumulates and causes damage. But with age, catalase activity declines. Antioxidant defenses weaken, and hydrogen peroxide begins to build up within the hair shaft. This hydrogen peroxide doesn't just bleach existing melanin. It damages the enzymes the melanocytes need to keep producing new pigment. Gray hair is, in a very literal biochemical sense, being bleached from the inside by the byproducts of its own manufacturing process. The timing of all this is strongly genetic. The age at which graying begins is one of the most heritable of all human traits. If both your parents went gray early, Your probability of doing the same is significantly elevated. Populations with European ancestry tend to begin graying around their mid-30s on average, while people with East Asian and African ancestry typically start later. Stress genuinely does accelerate the process. Not instantly, as legend sometimes suggests, but through sustained increases in oxidative damage to the follicle environment, which is why the Marie Antoinette story, even if exaggerated, has a real biological mechanism behind it. There's one more layer worth understanding about hair color that doesn't get enough attention. What look like the same color from across a room are often genetically and chemically quite different up close. When you casually describe two people as both having brown hair, you may be pointing at hair that differs meaningfully in eumelanin concentration, in the chemical subtype of eumelanin present, in whether trace amounts of pheomelanin are adding warmth or copper tones, in the size and distribution of the melanosomes carrying the pigment, and in how the pigment is distributed through the cortex of the hair shaft. These variations are each influenced by different genetic variants scattered across different chromosomes, producing what is effectively a continuous spectrum of shades rather than a set of cleanly bounded categories. Brown hair is not one color. It is dozens or hundreds of subtly distinct shades, all of which humans have agreed to call brown, because language needs categories even when biology provides a gradient. This is why hair color categories feel simultaneously real and insufficient. They capture genuine biological clusters, regions of the pigment space where genetics tends to produce similar outputs across many people. But within each cluster, the variation is continuous, enormous, and genetically complex in ways that the labels completely fail to capture. Dark brown and medium brown are pointing at genuinely different biology, not just different words for the same thing. So what determines your hair color? It is the combined output of two specific pigment molecules, eumelanin and pheomelanin, set by the interaction of hundreds of genetic variants across your genome, organized by a master switch gene whose functional state was shaped by tens of thousands of years of your ancestors moving to new climates and adapting their pigmentation to survive them. It is delivered continuously by melanocyte cells drawing from a stem cell reservoir that gradually depletes across a lifetime, producing a color that is not fixed but dynamic, not simple but staggeringly complex, and not arbitrary, but the accumulated record of evolutionary pressures your ancestors faced in the specific places they lived. The redhead in Ireland is carrying the fingerprint of a population whose survival in low UV northern winters was improved by losing the UV protection they no longer needed as urgently. The person with jet black hair is carrying the baseline of a species that spent the vast majority of its evolutionary history in high UV equatorial Africa, where that protection was non-negotiable. The person going gray is watching their melanocyte stem cell reservoir slowly exhaust itself through the same biological clock that governs aging across every system in the body. Every strand of hair on your head is doing something specific, built for a reason, shaped by history, and still actively changing with your biology in real time. Which does make the casual decision to dye it a completely different color something of a minor act of defiance against 100,000 years of evolutionary effort. But the box of highlights is right there, and nobody can stop you.